This I, as you know it, does not exist, and I refuse to believe in separation. I refuse to believe in a separate self. At the same time, I do not want to be one with you, which also doesn't exist. But since you're trying so hard to exist, I must leave. I need to stand up for myself and take a stand and be myself. Which is that which would flower without reference to conditioning, influence. I had an insight about death and what is death. That feeling of death, which happens while we're living, sometimes called panic, anxiety, psychosis, all these different things, is the dying of that which is dead, the dying of that which has been programmed into us. And as that dies, it allows for more life to come in. It's the dying of that which is dead. And the fear that comes in is the trying to cling on to that which is dead, dying. It seems that the fear that arises at the time of psychological death is an epiphenomenon of the self. It is the self, it's experiencing itself dying. And when the self experiences itself dying, it almost prevents the dying. So it's the fear itself that prevents this dying that would allow more life, more light to come in. So the fear of this dying blocks the dying and creates more of a fearful self. So can one psychologically die, fully consciously awake without fear? Then there is no death. Maybe that's when psychological death stops, when there's no more psyche to die. I'm not sure. It's been a while since the last psychological death, which was experienced as the heart fluttering a little bit. No fear, a little bit of a physiological response. So then perhaps it's a release of energy that has no puff of an epiphenomenon of self involved. And then there is no death, and maybe that's where that phrase comes, to die before you die, and realize there is no death. When one is rooted in the universe, one realizes the universe never dies. The self dies, and the self can die before the physical body dies, and be rooted in the universe where there is no death. It seems there is a weirdness in the concept of understanding. I wonder if there's a point that one comes to, that one understands that one can't understand. Meaning the self can't understand. Yet there is some energy or perception that seems that it can understand the self and understand that the self can't understand. So when understanding, the process of understanding comes about, one can understand oneself. But then it seems that oneself comes to a point where one sees that one can't understand. one can only see clearly. What I'm trying to get at is that there's no entity there to understand. There's no separate entity apart from the moment to understand. There's understanding in a flash in the moment, but it's not attached to any continuous entity that can understand. An understanding appears and it's gone, and it's completely dropped. So it feels like understanding, but it's just a clear perception. Though it could be understanding, but understanding implies that there's someone there to understand, a separate entity apart from the flash. The flash is the moment. Each moment is a flash. This tree wasn't afraid to change course. It realized, hey, I'm going the wrong way. And it changed, and it didn't really care how ugly it might look. That's intelligence. Conditioning, thought, is darkness. And all it can do is assimilate. Make that which is presented in front of itself into itself. Whereas light, consciousness, shines unconditionally to allow that which is in front of it to differentiate, to become new, to become something that is a surprise, something unknown, to unfold something into manifestation and play out in front of itself as a joy and a delight. It delights in the unknown unfolding itself, whereas thought and darkness wants to know everything, wants to divide it up and categorize it and be in conflict with it, which is to try to control it. Which implies duality and cause and effect, of which there is none. There's only infinity watching itself. It's a hummingbird. Maggie. Nice to meet you. It's interesting for me to think about how going into an altered state, sometimes called psychosis, is a process of understanding all the misunderstandings. The trouble is, in that process, when that's being revealed to oneself, one takes that to be what is happening now, but it's revealing misunderstandings of the past, misunderstandings of how we've been conditioned to use our life in the wrong way. And it's a process of understanding the misunderstandings, so when the process ends, one can utilize that understanding of misunderstanding to create a life based on something else. But that's usually not how it happens. I noticed when walking by this river that it sounded a lot louder. Definitely does. And I thought, well, maybe it's deeper, like more water is flowing. And I thought, that doesn't make sense because it's been so hot. And it's actually shallower, and it's making a lot more noise because of all the ripples of the rocks. If it was deeper, it wouldn't be making so much noise with the friction on the rocks like that. And I was thinking about how our consciousness, when it's based on thought, is sort of like a shallow river. So shallow in terms of not very much consciousness, that it's just making a bunch of noise, which is the thought. The friction, because we think with our thoughts that we're some kind of shallow river. We don't see that we are a deep ocean, vast, and we're like the silent of the deep waters of the ocean and not the noise of a shallow river. It seems like because we can capture moments of our experience, our subjective experience inside, as recordings, as little internal movies and photographs, that there must be a photographer, that there must be a videographer, there must be a self recording these things. But really, it's a function, it's a phenomenon of the brain cells. The brain cells are recording. There's no self recording. And when the brain cells are used to record, it creates an appearance of a self, in that one believes one is the collection of recordings, or believes one is the one who is collecting the recordings and recalling the recordings in appropriate circumstances. One is the subject. But really, it is an epiphenomenon of bringing up a recording to meet a now moment that creates the illusion of a separate self. The image separates the being from the moment, from touching the moment. The photograph touches the moment, and the photograph, being old, can never see anything new. So, the brain cells themselves are being used wrongly to record, which creates the illusion of a self that's not there. So it's not a matter of getting rid of a self, but seeing, questioning, wondering, what is the function of the brain cells when they're not recording? Why do we want to record? Not we want to record. Why do the brain cells feel secure in recording? And is it because it feels safe operating in a very, very limited domain? You never look at the same river twice. Bunny rabbit. You are not a nutrient-rich soil in which I flower. You are the darkness of the past in which I cower. It is my brain cells that I must scour. This is the final hour. I make billions every year. Billions of brain cells and synaptic connections. I figured out the best deodorant. It's earthing, connecting one's feet and head to the grass. And I haven't really been wearing deodorant, and I haven't smelled as bad as usual. I think there's something about absorbing the energy of the earth that brings the microbiome and everything into balance. I don't know, but it's kind of cool, because that's the only real toxic thing I put on is regular deodorant. Hello, Mr. Fly on my cell phone. You are a funny looking one. You're very white and black. You're like a Dalmatian fly. And I woke up kind of late today. I got woken up early, and then I just felt like laying in bed because I woke up early the last 2 days. I got up at 11. And then I got ready to go to the park, and here I am at the park. But before I left, I heard people talking upstairs and saying, "Nothing ever goes right." And I just sort of cringed, like, oof. Like, that was the energy I was raised in. Nothing ever goes right. Fear, be afraid of everything, nothing works, try, work so hard. And I've experienced myself, there is a magical world within where everything unfolds perfectly. So hearing that really clashes with what I know is possible. So I was like, get me out of here. And now I'm at the park, and when I was driving to the park, I realized, oh, I can get coffee. So I have coffee, and everything's good now. And, you know, that's how some people feel life works, is nothing goes right. And that can be true sometimes. But the whole world right now is based on how nothing goes right, and we have to try so hard to fix it, and if humans don't intervene, everything's going to fall apart. It's human intervention that's making everything fall apart. I see a sign that says, "Save salmon." It's like, leave the salmon alone. Don't save them. Leave them alone, and they'll be fine. So it's just kind of a wrong orientation. So, I have lots to talk about today at some point, but right now I'm going to do some doing nothing, laying connected to the grass. And allow the universe to do its thing while I don't move a muscle. I'm laying with the right side of my head connected to the ground and my feet and my arm too. And I'm thinking about how, or something came to mind about how usually at this time in my biorhythm, I'm kind of manic or like have a lot of energy and I'm doing a lot of things on the computer and stuff. That's what I was doing last time before it crashed. And I even remember talking to myself in August and September about how I should be outside, but I can't help but do what I'm doing. And I was thinking about that business class, and right now it's a month until I might have another big crisis. Mid-June, and it's mid-May right now. And I'm just perfectly content laying on the ground. And I'm wondering if that will create a circuit with the earth as opposed to channeling the energy into structures of thought or human constructs. And I'm not saying that that's bad. I'm just saying I've already done that. And I've even talked to myself about how I seem to, when that energy comes in, I just write up the whole thing again from scratch of what I envision wanting to create someday. So if I've already done it, I don't need to go and do that again. Perhaps connecting with the earth is a lot more powerful, at least at this stage. So I wonder what will happen if I spend as much time as I can outside, connected to the earth. Listening to the birds. They haven't started up a full symphony yet. I'm wondering if the fluctuation of mania and then depression, the up and down, is within the field of duality, the field of opposites like love, hate, happiness, sadness. So mania seems like a good solution to the opposite, depression. And in that state, one can get a lot of things accomplished, very productive, but then it crashes upon itself because one is still working in the field of conditioned opposites. And we're conditioned to be in conflict with opposing forces. And one might get to a point in so-called mania where one feels one with the universe, but then it falls apart. It doesn't last. One gets reassimilated into the field of duality. And since one went all the way up to touch that, one goes way back down. So I'm wondering if there is any solution in the field of duality. And what I mean by that is sometimes in the state of so-called mania, one gets in connection with these feelings of needing to save the world or help the world or do something to save the world, and one creates many schemes and projects to do that, possibly. And that energy fuels a lot of possibilities being created. Some don't necessarily get finished. And maybe one of the reasons why it doesn't get finished is because the solution isn't within that field. And perhaps at some point, maybe one who is within that rhythm might come to see there is no solution within that field. Even if it's a high energy, highly conscious state of wanting to create some kind of project to help within that field of conditioning, of continuity, of conscious or unconscious thought. It can't be solved within that field. And when one sees that, one steps out of that field completely. But one has to clearly see that. Otherwise, when the energy of so-called mania comes back, one will be moved with that energy to create something within that field. And since that field is the field of opposites, whatever one creates in that field, even if it's with a lot of wonderful energy, will bounce back. It has an equal and opposite reaction somewhere else. And if one is creating that within a field of maybe supposed a little bit higher consciousness, and maybe creating it within oneself, then one feels the complete opposing force within oneself and one's own life. Because it might be something that is kind of out of the field and stream of continuity, but since one is surrounded by the field of thought, even if one creates something that is slightly outside the field within oneself, it's not able to, it might be able to have an effect on that field of thought somewhat, but that field of thought is so huge and surrounding and enveloping the being who's in the creative state that that field of thought doesn't want that. It doesn't want a solution. It wants to just continue this reaction, action, reaction, cause and effect. So if one tries to volitionally cause something on the field of cause and effect, the effect will be a violent retaliation within the being that is trying to put some kind of new higher cause on this field of cause and effect, because that being doesn't see that nothing can be done about it. Nothing. And when one sees that clearly and stops trying to do anything on that field with that energy that might be outside that field, then perhaps something flowers outside the field that then that field of thought can, since it's a flowering without reference to action and reaction, which is the field of thought and conditioning, the field of thought, this whole collective unconsciousness, or whatever you want to call it, this whole human conditioning pervading all of our brains at the same time. It's not a separate thing. It's not like we each came to know all of this separately. We're all in this field of thought. So if something is flowering outside that field of thought, without trying to impose any force on the field of force and opposing forces, that field will have no idea. If this is something unknown, this new flowering, it won't be something recognizable by the field of thought. And it won't be able to put any kind of opposing force on it. because it's something flowering without reference to the field of thought. And I'm wondering about that because of how I feel for this next month, that the complete non-doing of creating a circuit with this body to the earth, I don't know what that does. It doesn't matter. Perhaps that will create a different circuit, a different flowering. And maybe connecting one's body literally with the earth isn't important or necessary or the answer, but it's a gesture of, okay, there's this energy, and it seems to be here, seems to be wanting to differentiate, it seems to want it to do something, but I personally don't know what. I've had several rounds of trying to do something with it. But that doesn't work. So surrendering to this energy and the universe and having a gesture of, okay, I'll just lay down, surrender, make a circuit with the earth, which is a gesture, not necessarily the answer. It's a gesture of, okay, earth, I give this energy back to you and back to the world in however it wants to express, unfold, manifest, differentiate. I won't do these human construct gestures that are so conditioned and embedded in my neurology to go and do something. Now I have all this energy, I can go and do something. And I have so much energy that I want to do something to help. And if there's any help, it's realizing that that can't be helped. And what happens, I feel, something I've noticed is that I'm seeing some of these gestures of what happens as so-called symptoms of things. So if I'm in this energy and then I start doing and doing and doing, and it's building up and building up and building up in the field of doing, and it's just putting it back into the construct of thought and conditioning, and it's creating this like springboard effect and that I don't see. And then it bounces back, and then I go into all this scary stuff. And then, in some cases I've ended up being apprehended by the police. It's like, okay, I surrender. I tried to do something, and now I surrender to the authorities who are going to take me back to be reconditioned and assimilated into the field of conditioning as a separate entity in the field of cause and effect. So these things, when misunderstood, it seems that they play out in dramas. Instead of surrendering to the earth, I end up surrendering to the police, which are, the authorities of behavior. But it's possible to do some completely different behaviors. I could create all this stuff in the field of thought, or I could behave in such a way of connecting my body and brain to the earth and saying, I surrender to you, Earth, Gaia, so I don't have to surrender to the authorities of society, which are all human constructs. I want to surrender to the natural rhythm of the cosmos and the planet and give the energy back to that, or be a circuit with that. Or, another metaphorical drama that plays out sometimes is that people feel like they're being tested when they go into some of these altered states for longer periods of time. They feel like the universe is testing them. And there is some truth to that. It's not really a test, literally. But it does feel like we're trying to figure out how to be, how to act, how to behave. And again, what I've realized more recently is I don't think there's any solution to how to be or act or behave when trying to do something on the field of thought and conditioning. Because anything that one does will be assimilated into the field of thought and conditioning. So think of the thought of conditioning of one's family or parents. Even if my inner state is in a high state, anything I do is going to be interpreted by them as the old version of me. So I'm literally putting that energy back into reinforcing those structures, and then that's how I will at some point manifest, because that is the circuit, that's the battery that has been created, the battery with those brain cells, that those brains that are recording. And that's another one of those metaphors. People feel like I'm being watched or recorded or someone's spying on me. When we're in those higher states of consciousness, sometimes our brain isn't being used to record, like make pictures of things that are happening. We're actually creating, which we can't be making recordings. If our brain is recording, it's not able to create. So we don't realize our brain is in the creative state, though we might realize that. But we don't realize we are being recorded by others' brains who are assimilating us according to how they interpret us. So we do become subject to people's interpretations. And we might feel like we're kind of invincible, which is another thing that happens. But we're not, because we may feel we're invincible and be manifesting in a certain way, but people who are recording us and they know us, they aren't convincible that we are okay, and perhaps better than okay, in that we have changed radically. They feel like they're not okay. And then if they start thinking we're not okay, that they're not okay, what's going on, what's happening, they're so different, changes that being who has gone back into undifferentiated consciousness is changing them. It's differentiating them back into the self that others who have recorded them for years and years and years and know this person and how they should behave consistently as themselves, they put worry. And then, the people who know us the best and apparently love us the most are usually the ones that hand us over to the psychiatric authorities. So I think the state of kind of oblivion that happens sometimes is what makes us vulnerable to the interpretations of other people. And one might think that doesn't happen. Well, we end up getting interpreted as mental patients by psychiatrists. That's how they're interpreting us and how we're behaving. And that becomes a lifelong, not self-fulfilling prophecy. It's almost outside the self-fulfilling prophecy. It's a fulfilling prophecy of a medical system with years and billions of dollars of money into programming people to interpret people in that way, when there's so many things wrong with that on so many levels. So that's part of what I've realized, and part is also that it's not, I don't know if it's possible to be one's possible self around those who don't see possibilities. And oftentimes, though, unfortunately, we're disabled to the point where we can't leave. We can't get away. And then also, we're medicated in such a way that we never see that the conditional love is what is imprisoning us. It's the conditional love that has conditioned us to be how we are, which is not our true self. And that non-true self creates lots of problems, eventually leads to some terrible trauma, because one is in completely the wrong place at the wrong time. Because if one was one's true self and nurtured in unconditional love from the get-go, one wouldn't be over here. One would be somewhere else completely, on a completely different path. You know, think of the person who becomes an accountant because they thought it was a good idea and their parents were accountants and they're over here, when maybe they wanted to be a painter and they would have been over here. You know, it's a completely different world. So there's a world that is calculated as one's true self, as the seed of when that being is born, and even before that being is born. You know, the being, when they're conceived or born or whenever, they have the possibility of overcoming the conditioning and being one's true self that would manifest in the field of unconditional love. And then there's the one that would manifest in the field of conditioning and continuity from generations back. And the gap between that, the space between that, is the conflict. It's the conflict of the conditioned self and the possible self. And something that came to mind just now is that when one goes along the line of the conditioned self, it might be more challenging when that self structure breaks to figure out what the heck the original self, possible self, was, untainted. Whereas if one was going along that journey from the beginning, it would be pretty self-evident, perhaps. And that could be why people who the self breaks and they go into possibility in certain manifestations of it, they try this, they try that, and they seem very like non-committal and not able to finish things or not able to function, because one has lost that original connection. Something came to mind yesterday when I was walking too. Might be cool to make some videos for kids to prevent some of this shit from happening, rather than talking with adults, which is a lot of times like talking to a brick wall. Like, it's the same thing, trying to talk to the conditioning, which just creates this opposing force. There's a world where there are no opposing forces. It's a creative art, but it requires being very clear, perceptive, dynamic, fluid. Because the world of action and reaction is very rigid. If I say one thing to a certain person, they're going to react, and then if I react back, now we're just in this sort of tennis match where there's a winner and a loser. There's a world beyond all that, and we are seeds of that.